I'm Casey Dinges, Executive Advisor for the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thanks for joining me today as we discuss social equity in infrastructure. My guest today is Maya Trotz, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of South Florida. Welcome, Maya.
Thanks for having me here, Casey.
Maya, as modern society grows more diverse and expansive, so has the civil engineering profession. Over the past several years, the workforce has taken steps to increase its diversity, equity, and inclusion. But those values must also extend beyond the workplace and into the civil engineers' work. The structures they create shape our society as we know it. Therefore, good quality of life for all relies on a built environment that is equitable and inclusive. First of all, what does it mean to have equity in infrastructure?
That's a really timely and great question. And I'd like to take a step back and talk about a quote that Dr. Yvette Pearson normally uses. She's the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Texas, Dallas, and a very familiar face to ASCE. And I want to just read it to establish some definitions for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we normally use this acronym JEDI in academia and other spaces, especially when we talk about infrastructure. And the quote goes, "The diversity celebrates increases in numbers that still reflect minoritized status," and this is on campus, and incremental growth. "Inclusion celebrates awards for initiatives and credits itself for having a diverse candidate pool. Equity celebrates reductions in harm, revisions to abusive systems, and increases in support for people's life chances as reported by those who've been targeted. Whereas justice celebrates getting rid of practices and policies that were having disparate impacts on minoritized groups." So applied to infrastructure then, having equity in infrastructure to me means having infrastructure that all persons can access to increase life chances. And for civil engineers, we work a lot with built infrastructure, but the term infrastructure really encompasses also digital infrastructure, so access to broadband and all that sort of stuff, and social infrastructures. And all of these are quite interconnected. In terms of, if we look at things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, they also identify some basic standards for infrastructure that speak about equity and can therefore help to motivate our work. And we could think of Target 6.1 that we must achieve by 2030, universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. And for me, the key here is this term access. And ensuring access really requires that we work with customers to first identify the challenge and then develop a safe and affordable solution that will be utilized. You know, many times we hear of engineers putting in these technologies that are inappropriate and not culturally representative or appropriate for the place that something was put. So it's really about thinking differently about how we ensure access. And the SDGs go on, you know, to talk about equitable access to things like sanitation and hygiene, access to energy services, and many times renewable energy and clean energy, safe, affordable, accessible, sustainable transport systems, access to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and basic services, safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, and then quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. And I think a key challenge of our time is figuring out what this equitable really means in terms of what is when we talk about infrastructure, what does it look like now if we're thinking of equity? What are metrics for success? I've been working with a team of really diverse disciplines and institutions and communities, and thinking, you know, is there a type of scorecard that we could then apply to infrastructures that sort of tease out whether it's equitable and just and meets, you know, these diversity and inclusivity goals that we might have for the communities or places that we're speaking of. Kind of long answer, but
no,
I just wanted
Maya,
to show.
No, thank you for that. And your comment about the broader definition of infrastructure in today's nomenclature, we're seeing that whole discussion play out in Washington right now. So I think that's very timely. Um, what stemmed social inequity in America's infrastructure, and why is it such a problem?
Well, I think a high level of social inequity, first of all, is not economically smart. It's bad for society, and it's also bad for business. But to go back to what stemmed it, there's this article that came out by Cross et al., The Misperception of Racial Economic Inequality, that looked at, from 1963 to 2016, if you had $100 for every $100 of white wealth, what was the perception of Black wealth? And in 1963, participants said it was $50. For every $100 of white wealth, Black wealth was $50. By 2016, the survey respondents thought that for every $100 of white wealth, Black wealth was closer to $90. Right? So the perception was that Black wealth was much closer to white wealth. The reality is that between 1963 and 2016, and today also, Black wealth has not shifted much, and it remains approximately 10% that of white wealth. So for every $100 of white wealth, Black wealth is $10. And I'm just using the Black communities and Black Americans to answer this question, but you could look at many other communities of color that have these levels of inequity. And to understand the wealth gap, which of course then has an implications for health, education, all of these things that we think of when we think social inequity, we really must look at structural and systemic practices of the past. And two books that I've read recently are The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein and Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And I think they do a good job at explaining why we are where we are today, especially in urban Black communities. And so I'll give a brief, my interpretation of that. The colonization segregated people, not just in the US, but anywhere where we had, colonized histories. And the abolition of slavery meant the persons who were previously enslaved still had to live in segregated areas. Many times those were places that had more industry, they had more flooding, there were, lower lying parts of town, vulnerable places. And these neighborhoods, in particular Black neighborhoods in urban communities, became or were redlined by the banking industry. So they were identified as very risky for loans. And this has been very detrimental to development in those communities. While at the same time, you had this move to suburbia for white Americans, where government subsidized a lot of the infrastructure there, where loans were readily accessible, where some industry moved. And then if you think of the type of infrastructure needed then for transportation to bring folks back into the city for jobs, to ensure goods from ports could get to suburbia, the question became, where would you place things like highways, which is something that we in civil engineering, we build a lot of. And unfortunately, many of those were placed, if you look around, where your older Black communities are, they are surrounding those places. And as you know, cars brought with it air pollution, which tends to have implications for health. The highways in Tampa, I work in East Tampa, majority African-American community, some of the first neighborhoods where Blacks could own homes. And there, the Interstate 275 and I-75 bound it. And I've been able to witness meetings in 2015, 16 to now, where there's a move to expand the highway. But you have people coming to meetings, talking about what it was like in the 60s when the highway first came through. And their road got blocked and the property values decreased. When the highway came through and bulldozed Central Avenue, which was sort of the Black economic engine with over, I think, 100 businesses there. And And how do you rebound from that kind of impact and that kind of trauma also? And I think those are important things for us to understand when we think of infrastructure and how we perceive and how social inequities manifest today. That if you don't have that economic engine of investment, if your property values are low, where do your dollars come to reinvest in things in the community? Where do you get to reinvest in education and all of these sorts of things? Your health is compromised. And then what type of agency do you have at a decision-making table for the types of infrastructure that come through there? And I think I teach a class now called Envision Sustainable Communities, and we try to dig a little more into this for the engineers. And it's interesting to me that some of them graduate students in the course, this is new stuff to them. It's new stuff to me also as a professor. It's not something that I would have been covering, 15 years ago. And I think many in our field are learning so much right now and really rethinking what it is to build the infrastructures that we study and that we are very proud of, right? That we could provide water and wastewater treatment, that we could provide services that get you from point A to point B, but also taking some responsibility for the impacts and the negative impacts that infrastructure has had, particularly on poorer communities, which inevitably in the US are communities of color.
So Maya, you may have touched upon this a little bit, but what factors widen the gaps in between affluent and disadvantaged communities? And how can more equitable and inclusive infrastructure improve areas that are high poverty and low opportunity?
So again, I think higher and lower income communities in the US are very much distinguished between majority white and majority people of color. So a major factor that widens the gap is race. And I think I've spoken about that and the historical role that race has played in policies and practices. So we really need to be able to find ways to address that issue. And it's so controversial right now. I'm in Florida and it's extremely controversial to try to look at this, but I think it's important that we do, because if we don't acknowledge it, how do we actually build something that is better?
That's certainly the first step, is an acknowledgement and a shared realization or understanding of what has happened.
Yeah, and I think the problem becomes where people think that they take it's a personal thing, and I think if we can move away from personal to look at the more structural and systemic ways it manifests, that might give us some more tools to work with. So it's not this like, you have these prejudices and so on, but actually sort of the prejudices and the way things were built, this is how it manifests, and we do not want citizens to experience life in our city like this. I think COVID-19 has brought to the fore some of these differences in lived experiences. We could think of, who could work from home at this time, who's been service workers in the front line, but those who have little access to personal protective equipment, right? Who has access to broadband so that they can access online education, who has access to green spaces for exercise and nutritious food, and linked to that, who has more comorbidities. And for those who live and work in lower income communities, these discrepancies are no surprise. And so I think to build more equitable and inclusive infrastructure while supporting areas characterized by lower income and opportunities for a happier life, I think we have to imagine what innovation spaces look like and who participates in that process of innovation and redevelopment. And can we have those spaces in some of the areas that are most vulnerable to things like climate change, to things like ability to pay, that are lacking in safe infrastructure? Can we work there and actually co-create with persons there infrastructures that are equitable and that satisfy multiple needs. We could think of, I think Catherine Coleman's book on waste describes what inequitable access to safe sanitation looks like. And so if we centered our infrastructure or innovation space there, would a solution be a pipe to a centralized treatment plant miles away? Or would a solution be something else that is more centered at the home and local community? And there are other examples of this. And so hopefully the process of co-creating knowledge and the innovations that will emerge from such investments in lower income communities will lead to the accessible infrastructure solutions that provide a better guarantee on life outcomes for persons.
And just to build on your point, the federal government recently reported that life expectancy for Americans had actually dropped, and it certainly had dropped more for people of color. And I think there were trends going on even before COVID hit that have been identified here. So certainly extremely compelling and timely to be discussing this. So what can civil engineers do to improve social equity in infrastructure? And what systems are the most critical for equitable development, if you can comment on that?
I think civil engineers can look at Canon 8 of our Code of Ethics, which is new, right? But it says that we should, in all matters related to our profession, treat persons fairly. And then it also says that we should consider the diversity of the community and shall endeavor in good faith to include diverse perspectives in the planning and performance of professional services. That really requires, to me, that we need to do a lot more community engaged work, and we do need to do a lot more work that questions sort of the structures that we are trying to build and how do we make them just and equitable.
Can you comment on which ones are most critical for equitable development, or is that too challenging to tackle?
I think, ASCE, we cover in our report card, a lot of the built infrastructure. And I think there are about 17 different infrastructures that we measure. Right. When you work with a community, I work with members of East Tampa, majority African American community in Tampa. And when you sit, to say, well, how do we actually try to work together? The issues that come up, many cases, are access to housing. So it's one thing to come in and say, I want to work on stormwater and green infrastructure when people are like, well, I might not even be here in another year or in another month. And so housing, things like criminal justice. And I think we have to be, as engineers, how does our infrastructure perpetuate what we see in terms of criminal justice, or how does it actually reduce, things that would actually put more Black men or Hispanic men into the criminal justice system? And I think there are many of our students that are looking to do the interdisciplinary research that answers and addresses some of those questions. And I could give an example of Dr. Maya Carrasquillo, who's now an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in civil and environmental engineering. I think she's probably the first Black professor in environmental engineering there, who'll be teaching courses on social infrastructure, social justice and infrastructure, and inclusive infrastructure. But when she came to do her PhD at USF, we were doing green infrastructure in East Tampa, and we were working with community members who wanted to put them on their properties, and normally we say, oh, we're going to put Florida-friendly plants in here and so on. And the questions they were asking were, if we're going to put this here, can we grow something that either feeds us or that we could sell to make money, right? So in this entrepreneurial side, which is not necessarily something that we had thought of, but it's definitely a more sensible way to approach green infrastructure. And so we thought that, Dr. Carrasquillo at the time would look at, can we do this on churches and have them, be part of the process of growing the plants and so on. And she said, hold on, take a step back. She wanted to really look at some of the injustice issues and how decisions were made, first of all, around stormwater. And that became more on decision-making processes and access to decision-making. And that work is now sort of being adopted by the city. So as we try to build more inclusive infrastructure, and as we were discussing before we started, Mr. Whit Reamer, who is now working with our mayor's office as the head of sustainability, chief of sustainability, has been coming up with a Tampa Bay resilience plan that tries to integrate some of that work there. So I would say in terms of systems that are most critical, I would prefer for people to work with communities to identify those things before sort of saying,
I think that's a good response, Maya. So I think we're running a little behind on time here, but let me try to get in another question or two here. Certainly, the issue of gentrification comes up in communities, and I think at times is controversial. So when creating a more equitable infrastructure, how can engineers avoid environmental gentrification?
Yeah, and you're seeing it a lot. So environmental gentrification is sort of where we're putting in environmental improvements in a community, like a park and so on.
Right.
But you have unintended consequences of attracting development that ultimately prices original members who would have been arguing for that park out of the community, out of the area. And that's happening in, where I work in East Tampa. And so I think engineers have to work with interdisciplinary teams that have expertise to guide community partnerships so that when we're developing or co-creating infrastructure, these things are part and parcel of the discussion. And so, for example, if property is being bought for green space, there is a discussion held on also property that is being procured for affordable housing. I think we have to be parts of these discussions, or we will be seen as putting in these improvements that lead to gentrification.
You were talking about some of the resilience efforts going on in the Tampa region a minute ago. So how can sustainability and resilience planning techniques enhance social equity?
Well, I think for both sustainability and resilience planning, we could think of the pillars of sustainability being environment, economic, and social. And social, colleague Jim Mahelsick likes to expand it. It's community participation, political cohesion, sociocultural respect. Those require lots of community engaged work. Similarly, for resilience planning, you can't do that without having everyone at the table sort of saying, well, what is resilience? Is it when a disruption comes that we want to have the least impact and bounce back to what we had before? Or is it that we have something that if a disruption comes, we come to a new normal and we're fine with that new normal, and that's built into our design? So I think it really requires a technique that can enhance social equity, is that technique of really listening to, understanding, building, co-creating with the communities that we are working with for the infrastructural development.
So Maya, to close out our session today, can you describe how equitable infrastructure contributes to a community's overall success?
Well, I think if it's equitable, it means everyone has access, and whether it's to safe transportation, water, all of these different things that we talked about in the beginning, which means that you are coming with your full self to realize your full potential. And who knows where that can take us in the world, right? So if we're all given that opportunity to really flourish, I think that is what equitable infrastructure means for communities, and the types of innovations, the types of livelihoods that people might have. Many talk about the happiness factor. Maybe that is the metric that we need to look at in terms of is our infrastructure promoting quality of life, and what does that mean for people in terms of measurements?
And on that uplifting note, Maya, I want to thank you for joining me today for this important discussion on social equity in infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you so much to ASCE for inviting me and for having this discussion.
Yeah, thanks again. And for more information on ASCE's Interchange series, visit asce.org/interchange. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time on ASCE's Interchange Live.